Yeah, I work in the Soil and Crop Sciences Department at Cornell, and I do a lot of field work for organic related research, including what Justin mentioned, the Organic Cropping Systems Project, which is, we're getting into the 11th year of that now. And just a quick remark on that, and that is if you can all support long-term systems trials, yes, that's the only way we can find out about crop rotations, because it takes more than one time through them to know what they're doing. So that's something to keep in mind.
It's a reason why I wanted to bring Brian down, because that is the main agronomy grain systems trial that Cornell is conducting right now, if I'm correct, right?
Seems like it to me, but
yeah. So Brian has things he can share from that they've learned.
Yeah, I'm going to be talking mostly about sort of lessons that we've learned from these first 10 years or so of that trial. Before I start though, who here, Justin mentioned that the soil has been degraded here for many, many, many years, like 50 years or more of tilled sweet corn production.
It's been cultivated for
maybe
700 years.
Yeah, okay.
Native
Americans even before that.
Flats. Yeah.
So, who has heard of perennial grain crops? Nice. And the advantage is that once you establish them, then for several years, they're perennials, you don't have to plow. So you can be building the soil. Well, our lab is initiating some projects with perennial wheatgrass, something called Kernza that has been developed by the Land Institute in Kansas, and also perennial perennial rye, which is something that has been developed in Eastern Europe. And so if you're interested in sort of being on our contact list, I'm going to pass around this clipboard, and please write your name and either a phone number or contact email or something, and we will be in touch with you as time goes on. It just we want to kind of gauge interest, and we want to start building a network of folks that are intrigued by it. You're not committing to hosting trials or anything like that, but just being in the loop with some of our research that happens. So, and just keep on passing that. Yeah, I'll take the. You don't have to worry about that as I speak. Okay, so again, I'm going to be using the results from our 10 years of research in this organic cropping systems project as like the basis of the points I'm going to make. And organic corn and soybeans right now are about 3 times the price of conventional. You probably know that. And I think I'm just going to a little plug here, it's a good time to consider transitioning to those crops if you're a grain producer and you're not so far. It's a good time to do that. There doesn't seem to be any increase in supply, dramatic increase in supply on the horizon. So, but those are commodity style crops. The demand for small grain crops, cereal grain crops, specialty grain crops, and the organic side is it's good, but it's not on that level. And most of the Midwestern organic, well, many let's put it this way, many of the organic grain producers are in a corn, sort of standard corn and soybean rotation. But in central New York, where we are based, it's not that kind of rotation. It goes corn, soybeans, then winter spelt or winter wheat is planted after the soybeans, and then clover seeded into that spelt, that winter grain. And the reason is that small grain crop provides the perfect opportunity to seed in red clover, which then supplies nitrogen that drives the whole system. The soybeans, if you just do a corn and soybean rotation, a lot of the nitrogen that the soybeans fix is exported with the grain of the soybeans, so not that much is left over.
About 30 pounds.
Something like that. I'm sure it varies, but it's not that much. Not enough for a full crop of corn. But for whatever fortuitous reason, these winter grains, and also the spring grains as well, if the weeds are not as bad of an issue, are just perfectly suited to a relay crop with the red clover. The red clover seeded in there, we frost seed it in, usually in March or April. Just spin it on the growing spelt crop, which is about this tall at that point. The clover does not reduce the yield of the small grain at all. And the clover, as Justin points out, it's tolerant of shade. It persists underneath the canopy of that small grain crop full through maturity. The grain crop is removed, and then the clover just goes gangbusters for the fall, and then gets plowed down the next year for the corn.
Do you mow it? Do you take any of the clover off?
We there's different sort of. The question was, do we mow it? We often mow the clover once in September after the grain harvest. So the grain is taken off in late July for spelt for us. We'll mow it at about usually 6 inches in September, and that's just to clip off any ragweed, which is our major weed that might want to go to seed, and then the clover just comes right back again. That's usually the only mowing we do. Sometimes farmers will actually let the clover go in for another yearly cycle and harvest a seed crop, red clover seed crop from that. But we haven't gone there. But anyways, the point I'm making here is just that corn and soybeans are the big money producers of this three-year rotation, but the engine that drives the whole thing is the clover that's seeded into the grain crop. And that's just the first. This is the handout that I made for you. It's very old school, low tech, just some numbered points. But I tried to list the sort of the takeaways that I hope you'll get from this. So that's one. Clover nitrogen is important. And in fact, when we put more like compost on the corn crop, did not respond. There was enough nitrogen from that clover plow down, and we got nice thick stands. It really was happy underneath the winter grain. Our average yields for corn are about 150 bushels, which at over $10 a bushel is a pretty good return for a crop, an organic crop. So anyways, the soybeans, of course, usually don't respond to fertilizer. They didn't, but the spelt does in this rotation. So a lot of the farmers were putting a little bit of compost on, maybe a ton or two per acre before the corn, but since we sort of gave them our results, they've shifted that fertility application to the winter spelt, and they bump up their yields basically from a ton per acre to a ton and a half by adding, it's basically a ton dry weight, half a ton dry weight of dry chicken manure to the before the spelt. And we put ours on pre-plant, and Justin and I were talking about, well, there's a lot of these questions, how to best manage fertility on these organic cereal grains, winter grains. Is pre-plant better, top dress better, what are the rates? There's a lot of variables here that need more research.
Especially in the east.
In the east, yeah, for our situation here in the northeast. Okay, one of these, there's all these sort of quirks about making a rotation work, and that is that we're planting the winter spelt after we harvest our soybeans. And that's a problem. That's a narrow window, especially our soil is not very well drained. So we're growing a group 0 soybean, a very early maturity group soybean, so that we can be sure to clean that off by the end of September and get the winter spelt in on the first week of October. The winter spelt is a little more tolerant of that late planting date than wheat is. So if you grow wheat, you're even kind of making it tighter there. So there's these tricks, but you just have to work with them. Okay, I mentioned here, I'm so glad that we got a little lesson about Hessian fly. You want to wait until the Hessian fly free date to plant any of these small grains. Another name for Hessian fly is barley midge. So it's undoubtedly was a pest of at least wheat and barley back in the old days. As we get more specialty winter grains and cereal grain crops, we're going to see more of these old-fashioned pests, and they haven't been around because they're kind of rare crops these days. They're not all around us like they used to be, 200 years ago. Okay, I was so glad that somebody mentioned that in this type of rotation, which is the same thing that Justin had in his, where a red clover was planted underneath the winter grain, there's basically an 18-month period of no tillage. From the fall, when there was tillage to plant the winter grain, till going through the next year, and then the following spring, when the clover's tilled under for corn. Well, that's great in so many ways, but perennial weeds love that. So, in other words, in organic production, the tillage and the perennial grain balance is that's one fights against the other. So if you have any perennial weed pressure on your fields, bindweed, Canada thistle are two real major ones that are quite common. You want to just think about your management, and you might even alter your management. You can till your clover under earlier and plant something else if you need to, etc. You need to respond to the situation that you see. However, that winter grain and then the whole season of clover really is good for suppressing summer annual weeds, especially, like I mentioned, if you do a little mowing in early September before, like something like ragweed sets viable seed, and then you've just kind of eliminated the seed crop for that year. So that's a plus. So that you can see that perennial weeds, kind of, it's a minus. Annual weeds, it's a plus. And just to step back one step further, I think we really need to integrate animals more into our production agriculture. We tend to be either crops or animal farms. And if you can grow alfalfa, for instance, for 3-4 years in a hay seeding, intensively harvested for high quality hay, you will essentially clean the fields up of all the weed pressure except for quackgrass. Quackgrass is like the only weed that can stand up to that. And you'll reduce the annual weeds, and you'll clean up a lot of the perennial weeds. So there's all these tricks with longer rotations, more diverse rotations. And I don't know, I think, yeah, this is a good place to stop. I don't know if Justin, if you wanted to chime in with anything, or I'm going to sort of shift gears a little bit here.
No,
okay. Well, the last few points.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, question.
So why red clover? Why not other kinds of clover?
Yeah, red clover is like the workhorse. Red clover is like it's cheap, it establishes well, and it's shade tolerant. Some of the clovers are actually not very shade tolerant. It's very winter hardy for us. In our area, crimson clover is not as reliable over the winter, so red clover, we use medium red clover. There's also mammoth red clover, but the medium red clover is kind of the workhorse species. So that's a great question. I'm sure that 20 years from now we will have a bigger toolkit for all these cover crops because there's such an explosion of interest in them now. There are so many clover species all over Eurasia, and there's so many other legumes all over the world that we could probably be growing, but we don't even know what they are. So it's a great question.
I heard crimson clover.
Quick points to finish up. And one, I mentioned that organic feed corn and soybean prices are high, and the market for specialty crops for human consumption requires a lot more attention to detail to keep the quality high, and that's all the way through the growing process and then to harvest and storage. So I don't have the time to go into it all now, but for instance, one issue that has come up is we grow tofu soybeans, and if you have a weedy field and the soybeans are brown and dead and the weeds are green, you can stain those beans and they may be rejected for tofu production. So it's just things like that are always considerations for the higher priced human food market. So just go into the production of emmer, spelt, tofu beans, etc., with an open mind and open eyes, and being aware and talking with other farmers who are growing it. That's the best school to get the lowdown on keeping the quality high, so you can get those markets. And of course, marketing things like emmer is completely different than the mass market for organic corn and soybeans. So it's another aspect. And just wanted to kind of mention that. We've had a little bit of experience with winter barley in our area in central New York, and it's we have had serious problems over the winter. The pH needs to be high, the drainage needs to be good, and then in a severe winter like last year, you can get some actual winter damage from temperatures. So it's you know, it used to be grown in our region 150 years ago, but you know, I think over time people sort of dropped it. Again, with all these variety trials and things that are going on now, I think we're going to be able to home in on some varieties that will be successful for us. But just some important considerations for barley. We also grew buckwheat, and for us that was a complete disaster. And I strongly recommend that if you are going to grow buckwheat, get yourself a I'm blanking on the name now. It's not a forage gatherer.
Swather?
A swather. Get yourself a swather, and then you'll be happy. But if you don't have a swather, you will probably be sad when you grow buckwheat.
I wish we have a swap just for this, because we're going to have a lot of weeds to
Yeah.
contend with.
So the proper equipment is vital, and we are lucky to have this outstanding farmer, Tor Oshner, near us, who has grown. He's also pioneered a lot of the marketing for some of the specialty cereal grains, but he grows about 300 acres of buckwheat every year and loves it and does great with it. And it's so good, so good for the soil, the weeds, and the pocketbook in this case. Finally, just one last thing here. The longer and more varied your rotation is, the better your weed control and probably your soil fertility management is going to be. And just as a quick example of that, we changed our rotation from that 3-year one, corn, soy, spelt, to a 6-year one where this was corn, soy, spelt, but then instead of corn, we did this double cropping of winter barley and then buckwheat. And that's great in a lot of ways, and it did wonders for our perennial weeds, which was the reason we did it. Because it allowed for tillage, midsummer tillage, when the other rotation didn't. So we're varying our crops, our tillage, our fertility, and that really helped with our weed management. Unfortunately, we did not have the equipment to harvest the buckwheat well, and we were pretty inexperienced with the barley, so it was not a moneymaker, but it was a good rotational tool to clean up a perennial weed problem. So that's the last, and I think that's all my points.